Okay, everybody, it's 7:30 and we need to start. Thank you very much for coming so early. And can I just welcome you back after a lovely summer? Let's all forget about what happened in July. I'm very delighted to have the Measures family here in the front row, who have come from all over England to come to hear this talk. So thank you very much. We're very honoured that you've done this. So, okay, over to you. This is all part, by the way, of the Lambeth Festival of events. Okay? All right, over to you.
Thank you very much to the Streatham Society for inviting me. This evening I'm here to talk about the Measures brothers, iron and steel merchants who developed incredible orchid collections in Camberwell and Streatham. And let me see if I can make this work. There we go. So the focus of the talk is mainly on two brothers, Richard Isaac and Robert Herbert Measures, often known as R.I. and R.H. Together, these brothers ran Measures Brothers Iron and Steel Company, and as wealthy businessmen in the late Victorian and Edwardian era, they both became eminent collectors and growers of orchids, rare and valuable plants at the time. In the talk, I'm going to give a bit of background on where they came from, a bit about their families, a bit about their orchid collecting, and the rise and fall of the Measures Brothers business. But before I get on to the talk itself, I just want to say a very big thank you to the descendants of Robert and Richard Measures, some of whom I've been in touch with over the past 4 years or so, since I first posted a blog about the brothers on from some of the early research I'd been doing. And some of them are here this evening. So may well be able to add a lot more to the story later than I'm able to share. These descendants, Jane Welsh, Robert Wilkinson and Ben French from the Robert Measures line, and Ian McCurdy, Jonathan Hughes and Sam Butler from the Richard Measures line, have shared valuable insights into the older Measures family, as well as incredible images, many of which you'll see included this evening, including these two here. I just want to say a quick thanks also to the Royal Horticultural Society for some of the images of orchids that you'll see this evening, and to John Brown of the Streatham Society, who's been so generous in sharing his knowledge of Robert Measures and his legacy in Streatham, and lots more wonderful images. Lastly, and not least, thanks to my very good friend and co-researcher, Chris Beddoe, who really started the research into the Measures brothers back in 2019, when she was helping me out with my Loughborough Road history project. So now the thanks are done, I'll get on with the talk. But quickly, a bit more background of how I first came across the Measures brothers. It started through my research into Nellie Roberts, the first and longest serving orchid artist for the Royal Horticultural Society, who lived all her life on Loughborough Road in North Brixton, just down the street from where I live now. And I really started looking at the history of some of the people connected to Loughborough Road from about 2018 onwards, and myself and some of the neighbours got a little Heritage Lottery Fund grant, and we looked at some of the history of the shops and pubs and people of the street. And as part of that, I did quite a lot of research into Nellie's life. And we had an exhibition of her work in the Sam May Gallery, which was the old Loughborough Hotel pub, in 2019, and there's a poster from the exhibition. So the gallery's just opposite to where Nellie used to live. And in researching for the exhibition, that's when we first came across Richard Measures, who has quite a close connection to Nellie, which I'll talk about in a minute. Anyway, I've continued to champion Nellie and raise the profile of her work as an amazing orchid artist. We've put a plaque on her unmarked grave in Lambeth Cemetery, and we've put a plaque on the house where she lived all her life and painted about 10,000 orchid paintings. So it was Richard Measures, it's a bit of a blurry picture, it was Richard Measures who was responsible for discovering Nellie's talent as an orchid artist, as this letter, written by Nellie in 1949, held at the RHS Lindley Library shows. The letter was written to a Mr. Stern, who was the librarian at the RHS at the time. And part of the letter says, Mr. H. Chapman, orchid grower for Mr. Measures and a member of the Orchid Committee, informed me that the committee was considering the advisability of having paintings made of their awarded orchids, and advised me to send in a specimen of my work, which Mr. Measures kindly loaned me. The letter also confirms that Nellie had been specialising in painting orchids since the early 1890s, since Mr. Richard Measures had seen one of her paintings in her father's jewellery shop window in Loughborough Road. So she was painting Richard Measures' orchids for about 4 or 5 years before she was taken on as the official orchid artist for the RHS committee. Just a bit of background, the RHS Orchid Committee was set up in 1889, and after 8 years of looking at orchid plants, they realised that they were finding it difficult to compare the different species and new hybrids that were coming along, so they decided they needed some way of documenting the different blooms, hence taking on an orchid artist. And after submitting an example of her orchid paintings, Nellie was taken on in 1897 and painted all the award-winning orchids for the RHS for the next 56 years. And here's a map, just to show you sort of how close Nellie was to Richard Measures' collection. So here's Nellie's house down on Loughborough Road, and this is where Richard Isaac Measures had his orchid collection. Can't really see it very well, but there's little crosses here. So this is his house, and his orchids were here. And this is Camberwell New Road that goes up to Oval here, and that's Whitesfield Park. So anyway, just a bit of context into how I first came across Richard Measures and his connection to Nellie Roberts. And here are 2 of Nellie's paintings of Richard Measures' award-winning orchids, both named after his house in Camberwell, Cambridge Lodge, which gives a nod to the county that Richard came from, which I'll talk about in a minute. And in the early days, Richard may have commissioned other artists to paint his orchids. He'd started his collection in about the mid-1870s. But Nellie Roberts was his primary artist from about the mid-1890s onwards. Prominent orchid collectors of the time did commission artists to paint their collection to confirm its status, but also to help with promoting and selling their plants to other collectors. This worked well when the plants weren't in bloom, particularly, or they couldn't be transported for buyers to see. And while Richard was having his orchid collection painted by Nellie Roberts in Camberwell, his brother Robert Measures, or R.H. Measures as he's more commonly known, was commissioning paintings of his own extensive collection of orchids at Woodlands in Streatham. Robert mainly commissioned James Laird McFarlane to paint his collection. McFarlane was an established painter of orchids before Nellie started her career as an orchid artist, and he painted for many of the prominent orchid collectors of the time, including Sir Trevor Lawrence, who was instrumental in actually setting up the RHS Orchid Committee. And these 2 plates are taken from this fantastic book, which was written by the RHS art curator last year, Charlotte Brooks. And in her book, Charlotte highlights the important role that the Measures brothers and Sir Trevor Lawrence played in driving the painting of orchid hybrids and species that has formed the basis of the RHS's orchid painting collection today. These 2 examples are from the book by McFarlane, one for Lawrence and one for R.H. Measures. And like the 2 paintings previously by Nellie Roberts, the orchids hybrids are named after the places where the prominent growers had their collections. So Lawrence had his collection at Burford, and so, so his is Burfordiense, and Robert Measures, of course, was at Woodlands, so that's Woodlandense, and I won't purport to know very much about the naming of orchids, but you can read all about it in Charlotte's book. Anyway, that's a little bit about orchid painting and how I came to be aware of the Measures brothers in the first place. But who were the Measures brothers? Well, their early years were spent in Thorney, Cambridgeshire, and Deeping, Lincolnshire. They came from humble beginnings, much more humble than many of the orchid collectors of the Victorian and Edwardian era, the likes of the Rothschilds, the Schroders, and Sir Trevor Lawrence. Their father, Thomas Measures, was a miller, and their mother, Jane, became a baker. And Richard Isaac was born in 1834, the oldest of the children, and Robert was actually the 5th child, born in 1840. And Thomas, yes, was a miller, and here is a mill that he may have actually milled in, because that's a converted mill in Thorney, Cambridgeshire today. So Thomas Measures was originally from Deeping, Lincolnshire himself, and I'm not doing very well, am I? So he was originally from Deeping himself, and in the mid-1840s, he moved back to Deeping with his wife Jane, his 6 young sons. But the early years back in Deeping were not happy ones. In 1848, the year was quite tumultuous for the family. Father Thomas died in the February of 1848. Then second son William, aged just 14, also passed away, possibly due to the cholera epidemic that was sweeping the country that year. Later that same year, Thomas and Jane's 6th child, Anne, was born. So Jane was a single mother, 5 sons, aged between 15 and 4, and a baby daughter. As I said, Jane followed in the family trade as a baker, a job she may well have been doing alongside her husband's work as a miller. The children didn't follow in the parents' footsteps into milling and the baking trade. Oldest son Richard, who seems to have been known as Isaac in his younger years, was working as a builder by his late teens. And Richard, Robert and George had all moved to London in their late teens and early 20s, no doubt to pursue opportunities in the booming capital city, much greater opportunity than perhaps was on offer in rural Lincolnshire in the mid-19th century. All were in the building trade. By 1861, Richard's a building foreman, Robert was a journeyman, a skilled building craftsman, and George was a joiner. Their brother John, a carpenter, followed them to London, but seems to have moved back to Deeping. I'm not sure what happened to Thomas, the 3rd son. Youngest Anne stayed in Deeping, married an agricultural labourer, and set up a fruit-selling business with her husband and children and grandchildren. So as the brothers arrived in London in the late 1850s and early 1860s, the city was booming and somewhat groaning under the pressure of expansion. There'd been the cholera outbreaks in 1858 and 10 years earlier in 1848, possibly the epidemic that killed their father and brother, William. The brothers would have arrived as the construction of Bazalgette's new sewer system was underway, and within a few years of their arrival, the railway network would open up new parts of London and there would be a further construction boom. Their skills in the building trade would have been in high demand. Richard based himself in London in those early years after leaving Lincolnshire, but Robert headed north to Manchester. The 2 brothers, Richard and Robert, were clearly ambitious and saw opportunity in the massive expansion of the cities across Britain. By 1870, they'd set up the Measures Brothers iron and steel business to supply the building trade. Brother George continued as an iron foreman, probably working for the Measures Brothers, but wasn't directly involved in running the company. So no doubt the contacts the brothers had made in the building trade in London and the northwest of England in the early years after leaving Lincolnshire set them in good stead as they launched their iron and steel business. The company and the brothers prospered. Whether the advert was true or just good marketing that they had the largest stock of steel in London, they were clearly supplying lots of different products, girders and iron and steel components for all types of building contracts across Britain. You can see here lamp posts, stink pipes for venting gases from the newly constructed sewers. Their clients included British and foreign governments, local government, commercial developers, individual builders. With the economy booming and some of the largest house building and infrastructure development projects the country had ever seen, Measures Brothers' business was also booming. As well as offices in Southwark Street and Croydon, they had offices in Manchester and Glasgow. And just a couple of examples of the projects that they provided iron and steel work for. They were involved in the rebuilding of the Foresters Music Hall on Bethnal Green Road. Measures supplied the iron girders and the columns in 1893. So no doubt that set them in good stead to provide ironwork for the construction of the many other music halls that were constructed in the late 19th century. And they also supplied £325,000 worth of iron and steel work for the construction of the Uttoxeter Brewery. So they were involved in lots of different types of projects. And while Measures Brothers were buying steel from British producers, most likely in Sheffield and Middlesbrough, With the increasing competition for UK steel and increasing production and steel fabrication across Europe, the Measures brothers were also importing steel girders and ironwork into Bristol from the Netherlands and into Holland Wharf on the Thames, which is just down from where Tate Modern is now. And they were also supplying steel internationally, as this advert in the Colonial and India newspaper shows. Their advert says that they are the best and cheapest joists on the market, specially adapted for pit props and colliery and mining work. So they were also supplying steel and iron products for a whole range of different industries, including mining, not just building and infrastructure projects. As the company expanded through the decades and their wealth grew, a number of their sons joined the business. And in 1899, Measures Brothers Limited was formed as a public company and shares were issued. So that's just a brief introduction to their business. And now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about the two separate families. So firstly, Richard Isaac and Mary Ann. Richard and Mary Ann Sadler had married at All Saints Church in Islington in 1859. They returned briefly to Lincolnshire after their wedding, but by 1861 were back in London, living in Woolwich, where their first child, Mary Jane, was born. During the 1860s, with Richard working as a building foreman, the family started moving closer to inner South London, first to Deptford, but firmly based themselves in Camberwell. They moved to bigger houses as the family grew and as Richard's wealth increased. Richard and Mary had 8 children over the 16 years that I found so far. Sons Richard Thomas and I think William went into the iron and steel and engineering business. Ernest, Henry or Harry, and Arthur set up a company manufacturing varnish, oil and paints. And this little map here just shows how they moved around in the Camberwell area once they first sort of settled in Camberwell. So by 1865, they were living up here, just off Warner Road. For those that know it, this is Camberwell New Road here. And by 1872, they were living here on Langton Road, just behind the drill hall, so not very far from where they eventually lived on Flodden Road. And by 1874, they were living at 242 Camberwell New Road. And it was when they were living here that Richard leased a plot of land from Lewis Minette in 1875 for 99 years. And he built 7 Flodden Road, which became known as Cambridge Lodge. So this map from 1871, Flodden Road hasn't yet been built. It was built sort of 6 years after. And for those of you that know the area a little bit, this is where Myottsville Park now stands, and that also hadn't been constructed or designed at the time. That came about 19 years later. So Arthur, Richard and Mary's youngest son, was born at Flodden Road in 1877. Sadly, the house doesn't remain. It was destroyed by a bomb in World War II. But we do have this architect's drawing held at Lambeth Archives. And this is when the Girls' Friendly Society owned the property in the 1920s and 1930s. And they were making some changes, an extension to the side of the building. They were converting what were the stables into extra rooms. So you can see it's quite an impressive house, bay windows, steps up to the front door. It was definitely a substantial house, and there are records saying that it had 7 bedrooms, 3 reception rooms, a billiard room, 2 bathrooms. And in 1881, the family had a cook, a housemaid, and a nursery nurse living with them, presumably to look after little Arthur, who'd been born a few years earlier. But that wasn't Richard and Mary's only house. They also had houses at Claremont in Uckfield and at Ladymead, East Harting, both in Sussex. And both of these houses were sizable in their own rights and also had sizable gardens. But it was at Cambridge Lodge in Camberwell where Richard probably spent most of his time because of his business endeavours and where he cultivated his orchid collection. So as I said, Richard started his orchid collection from about the mid-1870s, but by the mid-1890s, there were an estimated 6,000 orchid plants amassed in 18 greenhouses at the rear of Cambridge Lodge, and each glass house providing different growing conditions, replicating different climates. The collection was noted to be particularly strong for Masdevallia and Paphiopedilum plants. Oh, sorry. I'll go back. And then this is a rather lovely photo of one of Richard's greenhouses that was shared with me by Ian McCurdy, one of Richard's descendants, and then a rather nice painting by Nellie Roberts of one of Richard's award-winning Cattleya plants. And here are just a few more of Nellie Roberts' paintings of Richard Isaac Measures' award-winning orchids. Richard won a total of 84 awards from the RHS between 1876 and 1907. Many of them were before Nellie was taken on as the RHS orchid artist, so she only painted 13 of his award winners for the RHS. But she would have painted copies for Richard himself and painted many, many more of his other orchids that didn't win awards. Richard was particularly fond of his Cypridium slipper orchid collection, and he published the 3 editions of small volumes that document his collection. The first in 1887, and this 3rd edition in 1894 is held at the RHS Lindy Library, and it's a beautiful little leather-bound book, and if you've got any interest, I recommend you go and see it. But clearly, Richard didn't leave everything to his gardeners. Mr. Chapman was referred to as discovering Nellie Roberts, was the gardener for Richard Measures. But obviously Richard took a very keen interest in the orchid cultivation, care and documentation himself. He was clearly a busy man, heading up a significant business, running 3 properties and spending a fair amount of time with his orchids. The family were clearly living a very prosperous life. But sadly, in July of 1891, after 32 years of marriage and when she was aged 57, Richard's wife, Mary Ann, died. Their youngest child, Arthur Edwin, was 14. No one has yet shared a picture with me of Mary Ann, and I don't think this is her in this photo, which was shared with, which Ian shared with me. 18 months after Mary Ann's death, in January 1893, Richard Measures married Elizabeth Harrison Coombs. Richard was 60 and Elizabeth was 68. She was a widow and had been Richard and Mary Ann's neighbour for the whole time they'd been living on Flodden Road. And after the death of her husband, William Coombs, Elizabeth had been running a school in her large house just across the road from Cambridge Lodge. And I think this could possibly be Elizabeth. On the wedding day of Ernest Herbert Measures, in 1893. He married Kate Louisa May. Kate and Ernest seem to be the only ones that are smiling on the photo. I think this is definitely Richard here. As I say, I think this is Elizabeth, and I think these 2 women here are 2 of Richard's daughters, Frances and Annie. But the marriage between Richard and Elizabeth was to be for less than 2 years itself, as Elizabeth sadly died in September 1895, aged 70. But Richard wasn't a single man for long. Yes, less than a year after Elizabeth's death, he married Layla Eveline Atkinson. Layla was also a widow, but this time she'd been Richard's neighbour in Uckfield. She was 25 years younger than Richard when they married. They were together for 11 years until Richard's death in 1907. So Richard died in the August of 1907, I think from a stroke. And he had been the chairman of Measures Brothers Limited since it was made a public company, but in 1902 he'd retired as he was feeling unwell. On his death, he left nearly £167,000, which is around 16.5 million in today's money. The estate was largely split between his 3rd wife, who was still with Layla, and the 8 children. He also left £50 to his brother George and his sister Annie, who was back in Deeping. Clearly, none of the family were interested in orchids or gardening, as the whole collection of plants, books and paintings, no doubt many by Nellie Roberts, from Cambridge Lodge was auctioned off in October 1907. And here's an advert by Prothero and Morris, who were the big orchid auctioneers of the time, advertising that auction. And they also sold off, the family also sold off Claremont in Uckfield, and there's another notice for everything, the garden and all its equipment being sold off there. So after 30 years of collecting, this eminent collection was all sold off. Layla continued to live in Uckfield, but not in Claremont, in another house, until her death in 1925. Ladymead, the third property, was sold off in 1909. So while Richard and Mary Ann were raising their family in Camberwell and developing an orchid collection at Cambridge Lodge, Brother Robert and his wife, Mary Clara, were also raising a family. Mary Clara Smith was from Ireland, and she had met and married Robert in Manchester in 1866 while he was working in the building trade up in the northwest. And here we have a young Robert Measures and Mary Clara when she's a little bit older, I think. Robert Herbert and Mary Clara had 11 children that I found. Their first son, Herbert, was born in Liverpool in February 1867, from records, which is just 2 months after Richard and Mary married. Quite shocking for the time. But this was no shotgun wedding. It was clearly a strong partnership, it seems, and the couple went on to have another 10 children. Sadly, 3 of the children died very young. Florence, born in 1872, died at just 21 days old. Rupert Henry, born in 1879, didn't make it to his birthday. He was less than a year old. And Camille Joseph, born in 1884, was just a week old when he died. Of the surviving boys, Herbert, Harold and Gilbert followed their father and uncle into the iron and steel and engineering business. Son Robert took an entirely different path and became a Catholic priest. Mary, his mother, was a devout Catholic, and she and Robert became great supporters of the Catholic Church, as we will see. And as you can see from where the children were born, if you can see on this slide, like his brother Richard, Robert and his family were based in Camberwell before moving to Streatham, certainly for at least 10 years. So Clara Jane was born in Camberwell in 1870, and then Rupert, who sadly died, was born in Camberwell in 1879. And the family moved to Streatham in the 1880s. So here is a family photo that Jane Welch has shared with me. And this is of Robert Herbert and Maria Clara, as she was sometimes known, with, I think, their 8 children, probably taken around 1893, as Mary, the youngest, looks about 3. I think this might be Herbert in the middle, the eldest son, because he was in his late 20s by that stage. And then left to right is possibly Harold, Gilbert, Lillian, Mary the youngest, Clara the oldest girl, Robin and Robert. But that's just my guess from having looked at the records. But it's a rather lovely photo, I think. So Robert purchased the Woodlands estate in Streatham in 1880. On this map from 1894, you can see that the Woodlands estate is right opposite where we are this evening. So here is St Leonard's Church, and this is the Woodlands house, and this is the Woodlands estate. So it would have been right opposite where we are this evening. It was reported at the time that Robert made the move to Woodlands on the advice of his doctor. He was suffering from work stress, and his doctor recommended moving to a country estate and taking up a hobby to help him relax. Of course, this area of Streatham was in the country in the late 1870s, and having looked into the family history, I think that it may not only have been work stress, but possibly also the ill health and subsequent death of his young son Robert that also contributed to RH's stress and his poor state of mental health, and his desire to move the family away from the congested Camberwell streets. Robert was said to have considered and rejected sailing as a distracting hobby and turned to horticulture, which is why he was attracted to Woodlands with its grounds. He was supposed to have cast aside other plants to focus his attention on and settled on orchids, an eminent distraction for a wealthy man in the late 19th century. Surprisingly, though, in the account of Robert taking up this hobby, no mention is made of his brother Richard, who already had an orchid collection in Camberwell. So I just find it a bit odd that there's sort of no nod to Richard being any kind of influence for Robert taking up his hobby in orchids. And I just get a bit of a sense that there might have been a bit of tension between the brothers, but that's just purely my speculation. Robert's gardens at Woodlands were clearly larger than those at Cambridge Lodge, but Woodlands was Robert's only property, unlike Richard, who had 2 other homes. But it wasn't only orchids Robert was growing in his extensive gardens. You can see here there were all sorts of orchards and lots of different plants being grown. And he even had a couple of cows. And in the 1880s, he's advertising here in the Stamford Mercury back in Lincolnshire for a youth to come and look after the cows, milk them, and join his team of gardeners. The property and grounds of Woodlands were certainly significant. Sadly, no photos of the Woodlands mansions remain, although Robert's grandson Robert has shared this picture of his cousin Philip, I think that's right. And this is Philip sitting astride a wonderful horse in front of the front door that we think is Woodlands Mansions. So there's a rather impressive front door with columns at each side, but that is the sort of only image that there is of the Woodlands Mansion. But there is a little remnant of the Woodlands estate that still remains today, and that's Becklands. So Becklands was built by Robert for Herbert, his eldest son, in 1893, and the house is still there. It looks like it needs a bit of love and attention at the moment, but it is just one remnant of the Woodlands estate that is still there. So Robert had a rather significant garden, but it was definitely orchids that he put his time and money into. And here he is, initially what I thought standing in front of one of his greenhouses, but actually I think it's just a conservatory, as those don't look like orchids inside. The photo was taken by Woodlands of Streatham, who photographed many of the great and the good of the area, and I know has a particular connection to Mark Berry, because Wayland used to live in the house that Mark lives in, Mark of the Streatham Society. But by 1901, Woodlands had 31 greenhouses where Robert and his gardeners cultivated and reared many new orchid varieties. The Cattleya house, which Robert took particular pride in, was 187 foot long and 24 foot wide. The greenhouses were kept at different temperatures according to the conditions required for the different plants. The gardeners and collectors, like Robert and his brother Richard, were at the forefront of trialling and learning about the conditions needed for successful cultivation of orchids. And this was a particular challenge in the London smog and cold, as Robert wrote about in the RHS Orchid Review in 1899. And he said, "In one glass house, we lost 228 Cattleya spikes, and in another, 260 leaves of Cypridium. In some cases, plants looked like they'd been sprayed with paraffin and soot." So you see the challenge of trying to cultivate these really quite difficult to grow orchids in the conditions of London of the time. It's interesting that despite being a prominent and well-respected orchid collector, that Robert's orchids didn't win any RHS awards, and I need to investigate a bit further as to why that was. Was he not putting them forward? I'm not sure. But he was certainly involved in and respected by many other prominent collectors. And the RHS Lindley Library holds 2 albums titled Orchids Painted from Specimens Flowered at Woodlands, containing 48 original watercolours by Macfarlane of Robert's orchid specimens. And as mentioned earlier, Macfarlane was Robert's preferred orchid artist, and he commissioned Macfarlane to paint 15 of his rarer orchids for a book he commissioned to document his collection, The Woodlands Orchids. The book was published in London and New York in 1901, written by a well-known journalist and author on orchids of the time, Frederick Boyle. It really sought to showcase what an expert Robert was in the orchid field. The book not only describes in detail the different orchid houses, the orchids themselves, but also where the original plants were acquired, from which growers. It's not exactly an easy read, but it does have some interestingly written accounts of ambitious and perilous journeys of some of the orchid finders dispatched round the world by collectors to plunder and bring back rare species. Several of the adventurers lost their lives through disease or were killed by animals or indigenous communities. An orchid brought back from a trip to New Guinea was sold in 1891 attached to a human skull. It was bought by Walter Rothschild. There's no evidence that Robert or Richard commissioned these kind of finders to go off around the world, but it is quite likely that they would have purchased orchids brought in from overseas, and certainly hybrids of those orchids. As I say, the book is an interesting read, and you can read it for free online at gutenberg.org, and it also includes the lovely plates that are included in the book. So while little remains of the Woodlands estate and Robert Measures's gardens in Streatham, he and his wife have left a lasting legacy in the area through the work they did in support of the Catholic Church. While Robert Measures himself was a Protestant, his wife, Mary Clara, was a devout Catholic, as I've said. And as mentioned previously, their son Robert became a Catholic priest. A few years after Robert and Mary moved to Woodlands, Robert was approached by Mother Mary Magdalene Taylor, mother of the poor servants of the Mother of God, who with the Sisters of the Order were ministering to the poor in central London, working particularly with women in Soho, Fleet Street and around Tower Hill. Mother Magdalene was looking for a large house in a rural area where she could set up a laundry, an industrial endeavour that could bring in an income for the sisters and a place to take the women they were seeking to help away from the poverty and temptations of central London. Robert supported the idea, and in 1888 he bought Russell House on the land just adjacent to Woodlands for the sisters to set up the laundry and home for the young women. Once established at Russell House, the sisters not only took in laundry and supported the women living with them to gain new skills for life in service rather than on the streets, they also worked in the community, visiting and supporting the poor, and set up a chapel at Russell House to hold Mass. Their congregation grew from 50 in 1888 to 260 the following year. The Mass at Russell House was said to have been the first time Catholic Mass had been held in Streatham since the Reformation. With the expanding congregation, a new place of worship was needed. And Robert Measures and his wife, Mary Clara, stepped in again and secured the land for building the Church of the English Martyrs in the grounds of Russell House. The church is still there, opposite where we are tonight. The foundation stone was laid by the Bishop of Southwark in May 1892, and the building was consecrated by the Archbishop of Westminster a year later in 1893. And sculptures of Robert and Mary, along with panels in the stained glass windows in the church, pay homage to them and their role in supporting the establishment of the church. So Richard and Mary have left a considerable legacy in Streatham through the church. Robert and Mary's son, a priest, as I've said his first Mass in the church in March 1901, but sadly, later that year, Mary Clara died. It must have been a great loss to the family. But in 1902, a year after his wife died, Robert himself was received into the Catholic Church. Robert expressed in his will that all his descendants should be married in the English Martyrs Church. In 1936, one of his grandsons, Max Measures, was married in the church, but it's not known if any other descendants have been married there. Any great-great-grandchildren interested? We can talk about that later. I'm sure the church would be very happy to have anybody. So here's another image of the church with the lodge house from Woodlands. As I said, there aren't many images, but that's one of the lodge house, and that's a lovely image shared with me by John Brown of the Streatham Society. So while Robert was clearly devoted to his wife Mary, like his brother Richard, Robert didn't sort of stay alone for long. And in 1904, 3 years after Mary Clara's death, he married Laura Winifred Gilbert. Laura was 26 when they married, and Robert was 64. They had a daughter, Kitty, in 1906, and we have some of Kitty's close relatives here with us this evening. And this is a rather fabulous photo, I think, of the two of them from Jane. But just 2.5 years after Robert and Laura had married, in July 1907, Woodlands and all the estate, including Robert's prized orchid collection, were sold. And that was just 3 months before his brother's orchid collection was sold later that year. Robert's standing as an orchid grower and the sheer extent of the orchid collection is referred to in the sales notices. The collection has long ranked among the richest in the country, and its disposal by auctioneers will take 6 days. So you can see how significant and substantial it was. And the land was sold off, and quite soon after, Tooting Beck Gardens and Fernwood Avenue were built. And this is a promotional notice from about 1910 of those new houses built all across the land where the Woodlands mansion would have stood and where the gardens would have stood. And you can still see these houses on the streets outside today. I'm not sure where Robert and Laura moved to in the intervening 2 years after selling Woodlands, but in 1909 they moved into this impressive 16th century mansion, Creeksea in Burnham-on-Crouch, purchased by Laura. But Robert just spent a couple of years living in the house at Creeksea, as he himself passed away in 1912. Although he was rushed to London for an operation at the last minute, but sadly he didn't survive and died in a private clinic just off Portland Place in central London. Robert left just over £1,000 in his will. This compared to £167,000 that his brother Richard had left in his will just 5 years earlier. Robert had a tumultuous last few years of his life, although maybe he wasn't suffering too much, if you don't mind me saying, in terms of material comfort based on where he was living when he died. We'll take a short break now for some refreshments, and then I'll come back with the last bit about what happened to the business and what happened to Robert in the last couple of years of his life. So the doors are opening. Browse the Streatham Society books, and there's also, if you're interested, a little book on Loughborough Road history that has a little story on Nellie Roberts as well, and you can come up and have a look at this book too. Thank you. I'll see you later. Here we go. So from a man of great standing who'd funded the building of a new church, had built up one of the finest orchid collections in the country, and had run a seemingly successful business, the latter had ultimately seen him fall from grace. And he ended up in court in 1911, charged with falsifying the accounts of Measures Brothers Limited business, with the explicit intention of deceiving and defrauding shareholders and potential investors. Back in 1902, Robert had taken over as chairman and managing director of Measures Brothers Limited when his brother Richard Measures retired. He took these roles somewhat reluctantly, apparently. In 1903, Measures Brothers Limited took over H&G Measures of Croydon, the engineering business owned by Robert's sons, Harry and Gilbert. Harry then became a director of Measures Brothers Limited. Then in 1907, the same year that his brother Richard Measures died, Robert resigned as chairman of Measures Brothers Limited, though he retained a seat on the board. This was also the year he sold off Woodlands and his orchid collection. Richard Thomas Measures, the son of Richard Isaac Measures, was elected chairman and also took over as joint managing director with Robert's son, Herbert. Are you keeping up? The board and management essentially were entirely controlled by the Measures family. There was concern about irregularities in the value of the company, first raised by some of the shareholders in 1908, but it took 3 years for the case to come to court. A few shareholders continued to press the Board of Trade to look into the case. It was only the second time the Board of Trade had used their powers that they had to look into the affairs of companies, so Measures was an important test case. It was an important case, it was such an important case that the prosecution was led by Attorney General of the time, Sir Rufus Isaacs. The defence was equally impressive, and Robert Measures appointed Sir Edward Carson, who later himself became Attorney General and was created Baron Carson. The trial was at the Old Bailey and was reported in many newspapers of the day. In his defence, many witnesses from the company said Robert Herbert was a good and honourable man who'd worked exceptionally hard for many years but had been ill and not always hands-on with the stocktake. Robert was found guilty of falsifying the accounts with the intention of deceiving shareholders and was sentenced to 7 months in prison at Wormwood Scrubs in late October 1911. I haven't been able to establish whether or not he actually served any time in prison. He died just 8 months after the sentence was passed, so he may have gone to prison for a month or so and then been released due to his ill health, or he may have been given dispensation because of his age and health and went to live in Creeksea. What the charge doesn't say is that nearly all the family seem to have had knowledge of what was going on. They all started selling off their shares when they were at the highest price. Not just Robert's family, but Richard and his family too. Robert and a number of the sons and nephews remained as directors on the board of the company throughout the investigations by the Board of Trade. And this set important case law that is still relevant today. Measures Brothers Limited v. Measures, on the role of directors, including that when a company goes into compulsory liquidation, the powers of its directors should cease and they automatically be dismissed from office, which didn't happen in the case of the Measures. The company of Measures Brothers Limited was eventually wound up by court order, but a new Measures Brothers company was set up and traded successfully for another 60 years into the 1970s. Laura, Robert's young wife, and her sister and daughter all held seats on the board, so it was good to see the women getting involved. It was just Robert's family who were involved in the business. Richard's family don't seem to have had any further dealings with iron and steel trade, as far as I can tell, although I've not explored it in any detail. Several of their sons do seem to have retired quite young. While Robert Measures and his wife, Mary Clara, left their legacy here in Streatham through the English Martyrs Church, he actually returned in death to near where he once lived in Camberwell. Robert's grave is not far from his brother Richard's in Camberwell Old Cemetery. Robert Herbert Measures, born in Cambridgeshire in 1840, was buried in 1912 alongside his young son Rupert, baby Camille, and his wife Mary Clara. His second wife Laura was also buried alongside them in 1975. Richard Measures is buried in a prominent plot alongside his two wives, Mary Ann and Elizabeth. His son, William Walter, was buried in the plot too on his death in 1927. And that's the end of Richard and Robert Measures. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?